Hi, this is Walter Carmichael, and I am commenting on the wisdom texts. So that would be the books Job through Ecclesiastes and then the book of Lamentations. There are a few common themes that run through the Old Testament. The main two regard absolute faith in Yahweh, and the second that God abhors unrighteous living. These two things form a structure within which the rest of the texts tend to fall. Job is interesting in its form, both because it personalizes the suffering of an individual that the text flat out says is righteous, and also because he questions the traditional understanding that God will punish the wretched and uplift the righteous. Job, while refusing to renounce God, does express questions and anger. It's Job's contention he did nothing wrong and was faithful even when life was good. When many people would, in fact, probably turn away from God. Each of his friends accuse him of committing some sin, even if accidentally and unknowingly. Of course, we as the reader are in on the joke. We know that there's something far bigger going on here, and we understand why Job protests his innocence, even though his friends don't. For his friends, this is simply not the logic that goes along with the common wisdom that God is in control. Typically, people of that time period associated ethical behavior with success and unethical behavior with ruin, thus proving that God was in control of the universe. Eventually, of course, God appears to Job and demonstrates through example, and without answering Job's questions, that he is in fact in charge of the universe, even though there remain some lingering questions about why unrighteous people are allowed seeming success. While this logic seems untraditional for its time, the story does hold that God is far more vast and powerful and holy than any mortal can understand. And this is underscored by the questions that God asks of Job. For example, in Job 38, verse 37, God asks, "Who has the wisdom to number the clouds, or who can tilt the waterskins of the heavens?" Job is left at the end, much like Abraham, Moses, Joseph, David, and Solomon, speechless, and in awe of a God who has simply shown himself to be more magnificent than he could have ever assumed. While the Psalms to me are a frustrating book to read straight through, I found it a book full of emotional responses to God with a width and depth larger than I expected. There were poems of thanksgiving, repentance, anger, remorse, wisdom, and praise. My Bible noted that the book of Psalms was broken into 5 sections, with the first 3 sections, Psalms 1 through 89, dealing with the failure of the Davidic covenant. Section 4 recalls Moses leading the people out of bondage and building the temple, while Book 5 affirms the sovereignty of God. In some ways, this parallels the Torah from the fall of man into exile and then Exodus to the building of the temple and remembering that God was faithful the entire time. I also found that a few of the Psalms that, while they were not intended originally as Christian in nature, had been repurposed either scripturally, like Psalm 22, which had a variety of images that were used in the writing of the Gospels in regarding to the crucifixion. Also, several that had their words adapted to Christian hymns, an appropriate use, I think, since Psalms has always been considered a sort of songbook. It was interesting to try to visualize the Jewish worship services that may have gone on at the time, 3,000 years ago, and to imagine them singing some of these songs much as we sing some of our favorite songs now. Proverbs I found to be compelling in its presentation of wisdom. The woman, of course, is utilized in imagery within this book, and there are 2 choices that people make. They can either follow the woman of wisdom or the woman of folly. The first leads to a righteous life, while the latter seduces with wicked words and leads to death. It may even be the precursor for images later used by the Christian church to cast women in the roles of virgin purity and streetwalker. I would be curious about research on that for another time. But there are several levels in which the first 9 chapters of Proverbs can be taken, either as a literal story of a father teaching a son, or priests to the culture at large. Either is effective, but both in their own different ways. The way that this that the book of Proverbs supports the laws is that all these proverbs are based on Jewish law and hold to the concept of righteousness being triumphant and faithfulness to God being the key. Everything in this book was taught with a theological standpoint in mind. This is a very different concept for the current culture that we live in westernized society. And I found it most interesting that the last two books of Proverbs didn't seem to be Hebrew in origin. Perhaps the Hebrews realized some of the value in some universal nuggets of wisdom from other cultures, especially the ones that fit within their own personal understandings or their own corporate understandings. Ecclesiastes struck an interesting note to me. In some ways, it reminded me of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you will die. Kind of a hopeless outlook on life, honestly. Yet in retrospect, I can contrast to that simply by stating the glory of God is far more than we mortals can understand. While we are dots in the overall canvas, God is the master painter. So perhaps there's a middle way. There's an appropriate level of enjoyment of life to be had and should be had. We shouldn't waste our life slaving away to our job. Because we need to remember that eventually we will die and very likely no one will remember us. However, God created each of us unique, and so we should treasure our experience within His creation. And again, the scriptural texts here give every bit of power and universal existence to God, placing humans as secondary, which backs up the law and the message of the prophets towards faithfulness. Ecclesiastes chapter 10, verse 1 says, "Dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a foul odor." So a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. I think the key there is that it specifies a little folly, not totally discounting the need for wisdom. The Song of Solomon to me speaks of God's love for Israel, and there are certainly many more levels of meanings that can be used from the text. However, for the purposes of this, that was my interpretation. Israel, much like the Christian church later in later interpretations, is of course the bride. And first the woman speaks of love, to which God replies. Then they are wed, much in the way that God has chosen the kingdom of Israel. And when she first goes out seeking her lover, she finds him, much as Israel is found by God and is rescued by God. And then when he comes to her door later at night and she decides it's too much work to get up and go to the door, by the time she changes her mind, of course, her lover, or God, has left. Which is why the second time she goes out seeking for God, she instead finds a city guard who treat her rather harshly and devastate her, much in the way the Assyrian and Babylonian armies did to the people of Israel and Judah. In the end, she's rescued by her lover, who now, despite her, at least from a biblical standpoint, tarnished status, he chooses to stay with her, much in the way that God redeems Israel and Judah, or at least redeems the people of Judah from Babylon. Lamentations, like the Deuteronomists and prophets, seems to purport that suffering is an indication of God's displeasure. Using metaphors and images, the poets provide images of suffering due to faithless people and the desperation of a defeated people who desire a return to their homeland and their God. However, there is some mention that perhaps some of those who suffer the most had the least to do with the causes of this calamity. Chapter 2, verses 11 and 12 are a good example. Because infants and babes faint in the streets of their city, they cry to their mothers. So the cries of the poor, the cries of the orphans, the cries of the babies, the cries of the widows, these are not the people who led Judah down the wrong path. And yet they will be the ones who are trampled upon the most and treated the most harshly, probably during the exile. But this is a community that was in covenant together with God, and therefore it's a community that suffers the sins together. The sins of the father, in some sense, are passed on to the children, as it was promised in the covenants. To me, the books of wisdom provide context and personalization of stories we've read so far. We aren't hearing about kings or prophets. These books talk about normal people and their natural reactions to the events going on around them, whether in the time of David or the exile. These speak to the reality of humanity living within the rules that have been presented in the Torah through the prophets. So that's what I've got for this time. Thanks, and I look forward to hearing your comments.